What's up guys, welcome back to another video. In this one I'm going to show you some things I learned along the way when building my mobile workbench. I know a lot of you have been asking me, how do you manage the cord on the rotary tray? Did you add additional wheels down the middle after a couple of weeks? How do you pivot all the way to the left and right? Or what's your end configuration on the miter saw when using the table saw? How do you plug it in, etc. So I'm just going to walk you around through some of those things in this video, so let's get to that. Let's go. Okay, so number one, I didn't get a chance in my last video to show you how I actually installed the miter saw, but I ended up using 1.5" screws, wood screws, to drill into the actual plywood piece, the original 4x8 sheet that I cut. So that was the first thing I ended up doing. I used a couple of washers and some nuts as well to kind of help me bring it up to elevation. One thing that I did not show in my last video was somehow I guess wood dries out and it ends up warping a little bit, whatnot. And so this piece in the bottom here actually ended up bowing a little bit at the bottom, and so what that did is it brought the elevation of my miter saw down about 1/8 of an inch, and so I had to shim it up a little bit. And so I ended up using just some washers, 2 washers, just to help it bring it up to elevation. And now this sits higher than the actual workbench elevation, so I'm good there. That's just some things you can do as well when you're actually monitoring or looking at your miter saw when you're building it. Number 2, some of y'all have been asking me, how did you space it, to the front or to the back, etc., to make it work out. And so my preference is I'm just going to leave the miter saw like this. I'm not going to be pivoting it all the way to both angles. It does come into conflict with the rotary tray 2x4 on the ends, simply because of the depth that I have built this rotary tray for. So for instance, it does not go all the way to the left or the right. It does come into conflict a little bit, but I am able to do 45-degree cuts. This one goes all the way to 57, and this one goes all the way to 47. So that's fine. That's more than enough than what I need. But if I ever need to make a deeper angled cut, then I'll definitely have to move it. But that's just something you can play with as well as far as the distance goes. So that's something else. So 57 degrees going this way, and 48 degrees going the other way. As long as I'm able to do 45-degree cuts, I'm okay. My end configuration, how are you setting yours up whenever you're not using it? I typically just keep it like this, to be quite honest. And so that's just something else you can do as well. Some of y'all have been asking me, how do I manage the cord? Well, it's pretty simple. All I did was I grabbed a little electrical cord support, cable staples, and I just held the SO cord just like so. So that's something you can do as well. Just secure it on one end, especially the front end, because that's really what's driving the rotary tray to connect to the power. And so that's how I do it. And so let me just show you an example of what that looks like. So when I am ready to use the table saw, I flip it down. You can see it's still in line there. And then you'll start to see that on the back end, it's not in conflict. So the cord back here is not coming into conflict with the rotary tray. That's because the power cord on the back end is angled this way. If it was angled straight, it would come into conflict. So that's something else you can do as well. I'll show you a closer clip of that here in a second. But the SO cord on the back, the power cord is actually angled like this with the same type of cable support. I have it just nailed into the 2x4 framing on the back end. And so when I'm using it, it just comes in, and then obviously the cord is just hanging like this on the back end, right? And then when I'm actually ready to use it again, you just bring it up, and it's back in the same configuration. The other thing that I did not do in my last video that I had to do after the fact is a little notch on the back of the framing. I actually ended up notching it on the back end right here, simply because of how I ended up leaving it at the end. So this is something you can do as well after the fact. I just used a scroll saw and I just notched it. That's because when I pivot it down, it has a pocket to go through, and it's not going to conflict with the actual mobile workbench. So that's that one. Now I'm going to show you how I do the power on this end, so let's get to that. Essentially what I ended up doing is just underneath the rotary tray. I have this surge protecting device that I've had for years, and so I figured, you know, let's make good use out of it and just plug it in here. And so it comes with a 15-foot extension cord, and so that's very helpful for whenever I'm, you know, using this outside the garage and connecting it to my outdoor outlet. So that's how I kind of have it stored over there. And this is the cord for the miter saw. You can see it just running underneath the rotary tray, and then it's at an angle going this way on the back end. That's just something you can do as well. One other thing I am going to do with the surge protecting device, I'm actually going to screw it up here. And that's simply because the sawdust, you know, from the table saw, you don't want it to go in through all these power outlets. And so that's just something I'm going to do. Just move this over to the top end and you can plug it in back there, and the same thing for the table saw. There's actually 10 outlets in this surge protecting device, so that's overkill. I don't need that many. You know, you can get a smaller one from Amazon with 4 outlets or 5 outlets, depending on what you're going to be powering up to your workbench. So that's how I manage the power cord or the power for the miter saw and the table saw. I just used a surge protecting device, you know, on the back end, and then plug everything in there. Again, you can use a smaller one for your needs. Okay, and the last thing I ended up doing that I did not go over in my last video, I did mention I was going to add them, but I ended up adding additional wheels down the middle. I guess it, you know, it helps out with the weight, since the miter saw is pretty heavy. You know, it's putting a lot of load on these legs here, so I figured let's just go ahead and add some just to make sure that it's not gonna bow significantly down the middle. So I ended up doing that, you know, so that's something you can do as well. Okay guys, so I think that's it for some lessons learned on the mobile workbench. Just to recap, I used 1.5-inch wood screws on the miter saw as I drilled it into the rotary tray. Another thing that ended up, you know, doing was the fact that the plywood piece in the bottom was bowing a little bit, so I ended up, you know, shimming it up with some washers. So that's something you can do as well when you're monitoring your wood and how it dries out. So I ended up using some washers there just to bring it up in elevation back to its original intent of being at least 1/16 of an inch higher than the actual elevation of the workbench. Number 2 was, you know, the pivot left and right. It does not go all the way to both areas, but it does go up to 57 degrees on this end and 48 degrees on the left end. I always keep it in this configuration when I'm using it, so if you're doing that, make sure you cut a notch on the back end just like I did, just so that the knob in the front is actually going through that pocket so that you can use the actual table saw. Number 4, the cord. How do you manage that? I ended up running it along the right end of the rotary tray just so that it's actually able to pivot up and down just like this. You can see it there, and then obviously you lock this end as well. So again, I did the notch in the back. I talked about the power in the back. I ended up using a, you know, 10 outlet surge protecting device, but you can use a smaller one from Amazon, like a 4 outlet or whatever your needs are for your mobile workbench. And then the last one is the wheels. I ended up adding wheels down the middle on both these posts just to make sure it's still going to be leveled for the duration of the actual mobile workbench. But anyways, that's some things I ended up doing that I did not get a chance to show in my last video. So, you know, hopefully you guys find this video helpful and you're actually able to implement some of these things in your workbench. But that's it for this one. We'll catch you guys in the next one. We'll see ya.